Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is Pat O'Brien, and he'll be discussing Alexander Thompson and the quest for peace in Western New York. Pat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Brady. It's really a pleasure to be on. Longtime listener, so it's nice to contribute.
That's great to hear. Well, Pat, you're a first timer, hopefully not a last timer. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Great. So I currently teach at the University of Tampa, where I'm an assistant teaching professor. I got a PhD at the University of South Carolina, where I worked with the historian Woody Holton, who's kind of known in the revolutionary field. I'm sure a lot of listeners know his books. Before that, I'd done a master's at McGill University and undergraduate at Providence College in Rhode Island. I also taught at the high school level in Brooklyn, New York for 2 years. My focus is on the American Revolution, obviously, but more specifically on the loyalists of the American Revolution. Very interested in, who people in the States might think of as the bad guys of the American Revolution, and people in Canada might see a little bit differently. But I'm particularly interested in the families that end up in Nova Scotia during the Revolution, the communities that they build there, the role of women in the creation of those communities, and then also the families who come back, kind of an undertold part of the story, the Loyalist families who end up back in the States after the war.
Yeah, nowhere better to talk about loyalism than Western New York for sure. So, Pat, tell us, you have all this material to draw on. Why did you choose this topic? Why did you want to write this article?
So it's really interesting, Brady. I had a fellowship at the Society of Cincinnati Library in Washington, D.C., and I went there specifically to learn more about the Loyalists. I wanted to pull everything they had that either referenced the Loyalists or talked about loyalism or referenced kind of the Civil War element of the American Revolution. And so while the week I was in Washington, D.C., I was pulling anything that the catalog suggested might contain reference to Loyalists. So I was reading things like travelers across the Atlantic, so people from Great Britain who were coming to the colonies, both soldiers and people, just regular people. I was reading accounts of people who were watching soldiers pass through their towns or who were talking about their neighbors. And this military report also came up because in it, Alexander Thompson encounters someone he knew from his time in New York City when he was younger, who chooses the opposite side in the American Revolution. So that's why it was in the finding aid, because there is this encounter between a patriot and a loyalist who knew each other when they were younger. So that's documented in the finding aid. But what I found was that the rest of the military report told us something very, very different than kind of what I was looking for. And it's something that doesn't fit perfectly into my current book project. I'm writing about a single family from Massachusetts who goes to Nova Scotia and then comes back. But I knew this report and I had it digitized and I photographed and I'd read it. And I really wanted to tell Thompson's story, the whole thing, not just the encounter with the loyalist, because I think it captures, as you were alluding to before, the really interesting dynamics at the end of the American Revolution that are going on in Western New York, between basically what's now Albany and the Great Lakes region. Thompson details that region in this military report in a really unique way that doesn't come up in a lot of other sources. He's traveling across really contested territory in early 1783, and I think telling us something really important about the end of the American Revolution. You know, we are in the year 2025, so people have been paying attention. There's been the reenactments at Lexington and Concord, and there's been a lot of people talking about the beginnings of the American Revolution. But here we had Thompson telling us a story about the end of it, and I think that that's something that kind of goes understudied in the broader field.
Yeah, Western New York is uniquely partisan in the whole scope of the war. I mean, it can't be viewed as anything other than a civil war there. So give us, for those who maybe aren't familiar, kind of a quick rundown. What's the revolution like in that part of the country?
Right. So again, my research, I tend to focus on Eastern Massachusetts, right? Like right outside of Boston. And of course, things are really contested there in the 1774, 1775, during the colonial crisis more broadly, but really in those years. And then after the British military leaves on St. Patrick's Day of 1776, the war kind of leaves New England, right? I mean, like there's some skirmishing. Of course, there's fighting in Rhode Island still, and Newport will be occupied by the British later on. So it doesn't entirely leave New England. But for Massachusetts, definitely that kind of like contest is really kind of over by March of 1776. And that's the furthest thing from the reality for the people of Western New York. The war is being fought there throughout the contest, right? From 1775 all the way through 1783, as we're kind of seeing here. There's a lot of violence between a variety of different groups, and I think that's also what makes Western New York super interesting, is that you have obviously American colonists who are fighting for the Patriot side. You have a variety of American colonists who are fighting for the British side. You also have multiple indigenous groups who have a variety of contesting loyalties. I think one thing the scholarships told us recently is that it's somewhat misleading to see Native American groups, a variety of different ones, as entirely British or entirely American or entirely indigenous in their perspective, right? A lot of these groups are favoring the side that has the upper hand at certain times, or who can provide them with the materials that they want and they need. And so Western New York, from battles like Oriskany and Saratoga, I mean, this is a contest that is really, like you mentioned, a civil war that pit neighbor against neighbor. The other thing that's interesting, and this does come up in Thompson's military report, is that you also have a lot of people, a lot of settlers, a lot of colonists in Western New York who are non-English speakers, right? These are fairly recent immigrants from Europe, a variety of them from what's now Germany, who are settling in Western New York, who also have a really unique perspective on the entire war, that is challenging for them to understand in the same way that people of English background understand it.
Yeah.
So you have this really unique crucible of the American Revolution in Western New York that leads to some really good literature on this, right? I think some of the books on Western New York, just like South Carolina, by the way, even though they're very far apart, you actually have really similar things going on in backcountry South Carolina that you have in Western New York. You have people who choose allegiances at different times for different reasons. And a lot of the fighting breaks down into these like civil conflicts that, even though they're part of the American Revolution, could almost be studied on their own as these individual conflicts that are within the revolution rather than just a part of it.
Yeah, Pat, if you could introduce us to really, the primary figure of this article, Alexander Thompson. Who is he?
Yeah, super interesting individual here. I'd never heard of him prior to holding this military report, and that's not entirely surprising, as he's not this really prominent figure who figures into any of the literature on the Revolution. He's from New York City. His father, as best we can tell, is a merchant in New York City. He enlists early for American forces in the Continental Army. I'm not a military historian, so one thing I love that you guys do is all these people really know their ranks and how you move through them and what these different titles mean, and that is very far from what I do. So I don't want to pretend that I can tell you how he rises through the rank to become Captain Alexander Thompson, but I can tell you that he serves in New Jersey in the Continental Army. He's also at Yorktown. He's kind of got a reputation for being an engineer, someone who can understand the groundworks that are required. And he gains favor with some ranking officials, and that gets him stationed after Yorktown in Western New York, right along the Mohawk River. There's a group of forts there along the Mohawk River, and again, being outside of kind of my specialty, I don't want to pretend to kind of know exactly where all of them are or what they're called or what their role was during the war. But there's a group of forts along the Mohawk River, basically west of what's now Albany, and he gets stationed there. And what's super interesting about Thompson is he doesn't want to go. We have a letter that he writes to his brother where he basically imagines being like banished to the periphery of, the American Revolution. Like, I'm being moved to this like back country where, there's going to be a lack of civilization is basically what he's implying. And he gets out there and he's actually pleasantly surprised with what he finds in Western New York. So then I can talk a little bit more about, what goes on with him. But it's interesting also to talk about him after the war. After the war, he'll spend the rest of his life basically at West Point, where he's got a commission at West Point. He's involved with a variety of individuals there. There is a portrait of him that I've included in the article, and I believe that hung at West Point for a while is where that portrait comes from. His son is probably more well known than him, actually. His son also is a member of the American Army who will serve in the Seminole Wars. Here, I'm in Florida currently. I'm in Tampa, but he'll actually be killed at the Battle of Lake Okeechobee during the Seminole Wars. So there's actually a little bit more about his son because his son plays kind of a prominent role in the Army at that time. But Willett's this like really, I'm sorry, not Willett. Thompson's this relatively minor figure who gets stationed on the Mohawk River at the end of the American Revolution.
Yeah, Pat, if we could, talk a little bit of shop. I always like to talk to historians. There are certain subjects, people, because it's a whole nation of people that we know will be helpful for us. This is a person that checks certain amount of boxes that pique our interest. They're worthy of our study. I've worked in microhistories in the past. You have as well in Massachusetts. So, maybe tell us what makes a person like Thompson stand out to you as, I guess, a worthy subject of research.
Brady, I love that question, and I love the way you phrased it too, as someone who's familiar with microhistory. When I work with my students, especially those who are wading into research for the first time, I encourage a lot of them to do microhistory. So for listeners who are kind of thinking like, what is microhistory? That's the idea that we can understand a broader moment in history by studying relatively who we would consider maybe less important figures, right? The average person, the common person, that we can build a ground up study of a moment rather than top down, right? So rather than looking at a George Washington or Alexander Hamilton, what can Thompson's experience during the Revolution tell us that someone like Washington or Hamilton cannot? And I always tell students to do microhistories because we're drawn to these type of stories, right? Like I think there's kind of a natural interest amongst us historians in knowing a little bit more about common people of the era. Like we learned from our textbooks in grade school and high school, we learn the kind of top down narratives. But it's fun when you do a bottom up story because you find these little niche stories that tell us, that illuminate a kind of period that can often be overlooked. Right. So, I mean, that's the fun of doing it. There are some challenges too, because George Washington has thousands of letters that are transcribed and available through the Founders Archive. Right. So there's a lot more source space for someone like that. Whereas Alexander Thompson, there's a couple of letters and he's got this military report and there's a portrait of him. But other than that, we don't really have much to work with. So there's also a little bit of the craft, like you said, talking shop, a little bit of the craft of being a historian here and trying to flesh out his world. It means reading a lot of like variety of sources that aren't by him and don't mention him, but they do talk about his world. So part of what I do in the article is, even though he's going to make this trek from the Mohawk River to Lake Ontario, even though he's going to make this move, you've got a variety of other individuals who make that same travel. And so we have his report of crossing Western New York, but we have other reports both before and after the war that we can juxtapose that report with. And then it highlights to us even more about how unique Thompson's experience is. Because we can say like, okay, this is what it was like before, this was like after. Now look how interesting Thompson's is because it's very different than those, right? There are some similarities, but there's also really unique differences. So I think you asked the perfect question there. These micro histories, some people might think, well, is this just a random event? And to some extent, yeah, maybe, but it tells us something fascinating that we don't get elsewhere.
I agree. I found it to be a very rewarding experience that's really opened up a lot of doors in the way I look at national events. But let's get back to Thompson a little bit. If he's going to have that post in Western New York, he's got to have at least a crash course understanding in native politics. Does he give us any insights into how he views this very complex world?
I think the way you said it right there is exactly what he understands. I think he knows, just from the writings we have, how volatile, I think would be the word I would use, how volatile the situation is in Western New York. I mean, I think he rightly views it as a powder keg, that at other points in the war has exploded, right? I mean, the Battle of Oriskany is one that he doesn't talk about in his military report, but he does talk about going over the same land where it was fought. And the thing he notes about like going over that where the Battle of Oriskany happened is that there's still human remains. There's bones that he sees visible, and so that to me, when I'm reading this, it's an acknowledgement of what he actually witnessed, but it's also an understanding on his part about how dangerous the socio-political environment of Western New York is. When he shows up, he very much understands that there's relative peace there, but that can probably be easily shattered depending on what occurs.
Yeah.
And so, so he's very aware that this position in Western New York is on the edge of what he would consider, like British North America. And it is a region that is stable but could slide into instability. And you get the sense from his journal that he doesn't want that to happen, right? I mean, this is not a guy who's going there to try to be seek glory or fame in battle. I don't think he has any intention of like securing a stronger hold for the American nation on Western New York. He is a New Yorker, but he never expresses kind of like any New York pride. He doesn't want to like secure Western New York from the British necessarily, although other people might want that, right? There might be other people in the Continental Army who are thinking, well, maybe if we can get a better hold on the Mohawk River and a better hold on Western New York when we would negotiate our borders, which is a big problem at this time, right? Especially in Western New York, parts of northern New England, the borders are ambiguous in 1783. And that's going to be a real point of contention at treaty discussions that are going on in Europe. And so, like, there are definitely people who are interested in those borders. I don't think Alexander Thompson is one of them. I don't think he's someone who sees his position as one of like, oh, I'm here to win a battle. He sees of kind of keeping the peace. That is what he is there to do, and he recognizes how dangerous that is.
Yeah, Pat, I suppose we can get to it. You read about he's a fairly important mission he's given. Sort of diplomatic mission, some military aspects to it. Could you kind of take us through that?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And I mean, when I picked up this military report, I didn't know anything about this and had never really thought about it, but it makes sense, right? At the end of the American Revolution, at a time before radio or television or cell phone, people had to deliver these type of messages, this news. And he's basically charged by who's in command in Western New York, but it's a letter that comes from Washington and from Washington's headquarters. He's charged with bringing a notice about an end to hostilities to the British garrison on the Great Lakes, right? To the British commander in Western New York. And what's really kind of interesting about this is why he's chosen. Now, it's never kind of explicitly stated in the military report or anywhere, but we can get a sense that part of the reason that Thompson has chosen to go to the Great Lake region is because he had been there before or been very, very close. Only about a year prior, not even a few months really prior, he had been part of this really kind of interesting, daring, some people even say foolish mission to go seize the British garrison on Oswego. To go seize that garrison, there's a movement of troops from the same place, from the western, right just west of Albany on the Mohawk River. I think about 400 men travel at breakneck speed, right? One thing I was really kind of struck by is how fast these men are traveling. In I think it's early January. They're traveling over snow, which makes it easier because they can use sleds, and then they get to the lake and they can travel across the ice. But they get basically outside of Oswego, and then they have to turn around because day is they get lost in the woods. And there's an interesting story here about how they got lost in the woods on this foolish kind of mission. They blame the Native American guide that they have for getting them lost. Basically, he enters the woods and claims it's going to be faster, more expedient to get to the Fort Oswego going through the woods, but then it gets walked around in circles, gets them lost, day breaks, and then Marinus Willett, who's in charge of it, has to turn around and head home because he supposedly has orders from Washington that like this has to be a surprise attack because it's kind of foolhardy. So if you lose the element of surprise, you have to abandon it. They turn around and go home, and they're moving much slower. They encounter bad weather. Men get frostbite. They lose men to the elements as part of this. So Thompson is a part of that. He gets frostbite, and he writes about the fact that he doesn't lose any of his extremities, but he certainly worries that he might. So he had been part of this earlier mission to Oswego. And basically, what happens is news comes from Washington like, hey, we need someone to go out there and tell them that the war's over. And all right, well, you've been. So, you're going again. You're not going to have 400 men. It's going to be a small party because you got to move quickly. We don't want to stir any hostilities, right? We don't want to kind of draw attention to this. We don't want to provoke any indigenous groups that are out there. And so that is how he is chosen to head back to Oswego. And then, I mean, the event itself is also really interesting because he has to consider what to take with him. He's declaring an end to hostilities, and there is a manual for this, right? In the late 18th century, there are rules governing how this works, but all of the rule books that are written about this talk about troops engagements that are close to each other, right? Basically, a surrendering group negotiating with another one that are in close proximity. And that, of course, doesn't apply. He's got to cover, more than 100 miles from Western New York to Oswego. And so he's, really, who do I bring, right? Who's going to lead this? Do I arm myself? And, the answer is that they probably shouldn't arm themselves. They're carrying a white flag. But he talks about deceit, being kind of deceptive, wrapping a musket in a blanket and taking that with them in case they encounter wildlife is his kind of justification. But you can also tell he's saying, well, in case we need to be armed, we need to have this as well. So it's this really interesting mission that goes out to Oswego in on the Great Lakes.
Yeah. So could we talk about the outcome of that mission? How does it look, and does he accomplish his goal?
Yeah, so the trip itself is rather uneventful, right? Although it's uneventful, but it's fascinating. He leaves Western New York. He leaves the forts on the Mohawk River, and very quickly writes about how he's basically left, civilization behind, right? Just departing from these forts, he's now entered hostile territory. And so they move as subtly as they can. They try to make sure that they don't run into any hostile indigenous groups because that might provoke violence. They do have the white flag with them, but he's kind of worried that this won't be recognized by different groups. And so they're traveling along the Mohawk River, and they get to the big lake that's in the area, Lake Oneata, right? I believe is the lake that he encounters. And then they have their own problem. It's what do we do now? Do we go around the outside of the lake? Well, that's going to take a long time. He had crossed it on the ice in the winter, but now there isn't the ice. And a really interesting thing occurs here. He has a Stockbridge. He calls him a Stockbridge chief. That's the only identifier that's used. So we don't know the man's name. We don't really know if he is a Stockbridge indigenous. That would make sense, but the Stockbridge people, of course, are from Massachusetts. So what he's doing there is also somewhat just up for debate. Why he's not being led by someone more locally is also interesting. It might do with that first trip about getting lost and kind of blaming it on the local indigenous groups. So there's a whole kind of mystery there. But the Stockbridge Indian chief basically says, no, we're going to cross this lake. It doesn't make sense to go around the outside of it. That's dangerous. It's going to take longer. So he knows of a hollowed out, it's basically a sailboat that exists on the side of the lake. And he says, we're going to go get that. So they go and get it, but then they have to fashion oars. They have to fashion a sail, and they do. One of the things that I think is remarkable about 18th century people, I always remind my students, they tend to think of people who lived in the past as being simpler people. They don't understand everything we have going on now because they don't have the internet. But I couldn't fashion a sail and oars on the side of a major lake while I'm facing hostility like these people could. And he sets off into the lake on this makeshift boat and is able to traverse it to the other side undetected. And when he gets to the other side, then they're in the rivers, and they eventually do encounter a British patrol. And his description of the British patrol is also really interesting. The British soldiers who are with a group of indigenous people from the area are identical to one another in their look. Meaning the British soldiers have kind of adopted Native American war paint. They're dressed like Native Americans, not like British soldiers. I mean, they speak English. They're clearly from Britain or the British colonies, but they're indistinguishable from the indigenous people that they're traveling with. And that's also super interesting because this is kind of a common trope that American soldiers, Continental soldiers in particular, will use to describe Britons who fight alongside Native Americans, right? They kind of describe them as quote unquote going native, which is not a that's not a compliment in the late 18th century. That's kind of a detriment to or a critique of British soldiers. But anyway, they encounter this scouting group, and they're able to basically say, take us to your leader. And they do. They get brought into Fort Oswego. They're blindfolded, and they're brought in. And then eventually, the commanding officer who is there for the British is like other commanding officers described often by Continental soldiers, the utmost gentleman, right? Unblindfolds them, apologizes for the fact that, they had to go through these measures, but is taking all sorts of precautions, and then basically wants to know what they're there for. After giving them a good meal, like fresh clothes, right? What are you here for? And Alexander Thompson relays to him the message, right? Has Washington's letter, gives it to the British commander, who reads it. There's like a general uproar, so that's also something I can maybe talk about a little bit later. But there's kind of outrage at what's being read amongst a variety of different groups, right? Native Americans who are there, British officers below the commander, a variety of loyalists who are there. There's kind of like outrage that peace has been reached. It's probably something they suspected was coming, but is maybe a surprise to them that it's come so soon. And the British commander basically gives it back to Thompson and says, "Thank you for letting me know, but nothing's going to come of this until I hear from my superior," right? Until I hear from Quebec any sort of kind of news, I can't just take your letter for word. We'll give you a party to make sure you get back to, we'll grant you passage to make sure you get back to your forts. But, it's basically an unsuccessful mission. Although it is really interesting, right? Because those groups who are outraged, the first thing they kind of do after Thompson says that he's basically sent on his way is they go and pull out all the maps they have in the fort. And they're like drawing a line basically on those maps about where the border is that Washington has said like now exists because of a cessation of hostilities. And that makes them even angrier because they're basically talking amongst themselves, and Thompson records them saying that there's really no American presence in these places, right? Like we've surrendered large portions of what's now New York and Ohio and Michigan that are entirely devoid of any like strong American presence. We've made cessation of hostilities, also given away tons of land. And the people who are angriest, at least according to Thompson, and again, we have to think about like prejudices and biases that are in Thompson's mind. Like he writes very prominently of the British officer, but never really anything good about the indigenous people. But the indigenous people get like a really bad rap because they're the ones who are most angry, according to Thompson. And this is what frightens him about going home, right? He also suggests that the loyalists who are there have stirred up the native people. And he thinks his life is in danger because the loyalists have basically told him, like, kill those guys on their way back. And so that's why he's really happy that he gets that kind of safe passage from the military commander at Oswego, because it prevents him from being killed.
Amazing. So, Pat, we usually end the show with the same question. I think it gets to the heart of what we do here. How do you think your research, what you found, helps us understand the Revolutionary era better?
Yeah, I appreciate what everyone brings to this part of the show. I've learned a ton. I love assigning these to my classes. They really have taken away a ton from what people have brought. I think what initially interested me in this is what I think is most important. We think so much about the origins of the American Revolution. Like so much scholarly blood has been spilt about what caused the American Revolution, right? Is this a social revolution? Is it a political revolution? Is it economic revolution? Is it some of the combination of these? I mean, there's, in graduate school, that whole classes focus on what is the cause of the American Revolution. And we don't get an answer to that from Thompson, right? There is the interaction between Thompson and the loyalist, where the loyalist basically says, I signed up for the British because I made more money in my time in British service than you'll make in your lifetime. So maybe we do get a little bit to the origins of at least loyalism. A lot of people did it because there's an economic incentive. But what I think Thompson's journal shows us is that at the end of the American Revolution, there are so many issues facing the nascent nation, right? I mean, in Western New York, this might be land that becomes quote unquote part of New York and then the United States in 1787. But it's hotly contested, right? I mean, there's really no ability for New York, the state, or the United States later to exert any control over this region. And there's a variety of people living there who don't necessarily accept the terms that are worked out on the other side of the ocean for what's going to dictate their lives. So again, I think when we get back to like Revolution 250, right, in 2025 and 2026, people talking about the Declaration of Independence, and these things are all very important, don't get me wrong. But I think we need to be equally aware come, what will it be, 2033, when it's 250 years since the end of the war, that the issues facing the young United States are just as challenging, if not more, than they were in 1775, 1776, right? Defeating the British Army, sure, that is a very high bar to jump. But building a new nation from a diverse group of people who have varying allegiances to different groups and ideologies and religions, I mean, that's a real challenge. And you have it in Thompson's journal. It's not what he necessarily is meant to be recording, but it's what's there. And so I think that that's the really important thing that we should be thinking about is that the American Revolution ends, but the revolutionary work has really only just begun, right? And so I think that that's kind of the big takeaway.
Well said. Pat O'Brien, thank you again so much for joining us.
Brady, thank you for having me, and thanks everyone who read. I appreciate it.
All right, hang on.